Hello and welcome back. Tonight we are stepping somewhere very few people ever truly got to go. Behind the gilded doors, beyond the incense and the ceremony and the towering stone arches. Past the bards and the bishops and the endless processions of silk-robed men walking in slow, deliberate silence through marble corridors lit by 1,000 candles. Tonight, we are going somewhere quiet and strange and enormously human. We are going inside the private lives of the Renaissance popes. Not the official version, not the painted portraits in gleaming robes with serious eyes and jeweled crosses. Not the public figure elevated above the world, surrounded by kneeling cardinals and murmuring prayers. We are going to the other side of that image, the man behind the mitre, the person who woke up each morning in the apostolic palace and lay awake each night with his own very unsaintly thoughts. The Pope who had a mistress, the Pope who loved gambling, the Pope who kept a pet elephant in the Vatican gardens and fed it sugarcane and laughed when it performed tricks for guests. The Pope who put on armor and rode to war. The Pope who fathered children and named streets after them and gave them duchedoms and made no particular effort to hide any of it.
The Renaissance papacy, roughly spanning the late 1300s through the early 1500s, was one of the most colorful, complicated, and frankly astonishing chapters in the long history of the Catholic Church. This was an era when the papacy was not merely a spiritual office, it was a political throne, an artistic empire, a dynastic machine, and in some cases, a family business. The popes of this period were powerful Italian rulers as much as they were religious leaders. They commanded armies, they signed treaties, they hosted banquets that made the feasts of kings look modest. They commissioned art that has not been equaled in the centuries since, and they did all of this from within the most sacred institution in the Christian world, often without a great deal of apparent concern about the contradiction. Rome itself in this era was a city in transformation. Ancient ruins jutted from the earth alongside brand new palaces. Pilgrims walked the same cobblestones as merchants, artists, prostitutes, and cardinals. The Tiber River wound through the city, carrying everything the city needed and much of what it wanted to discard. The smell of Rome in the 15th and 16th centuries was something remarkable. Roasting meat from market stalls, the damp stone of old churches, animal dung, perfume, river water, and the faint ghost of incense from every open chapel door. It was a city alive with ambition and beauty and rotting morality, and the men who sat atop it all watched from their palace windows with a complex mixture of satisfaction and unease. The population of Rome in the early 16th century was somewhere around 50,000 people. Small by modern standards, but large enough for its time and extraordinarily cosmopolitan. Romans had lived there since antiquity. Spanish families had followed the Borgia Pope. Germans came on pilgrimage and stayed. Florentines arrived with every papal connection to the Medici. There were Greeks, Africans, Turks, Venetians, Neapolitans, Frenchmen, and Englishmen, all moving through the same narrow streets, trading in the same markets, worshipping in the same churches that were themselves built on the foundations of temples to gods no longer worshipped. It was a layered city in every possible sense, layer upon layer of civilization, ambition, faith, failure, and reinvention, all pressed together in a relatively small space on the banks of a river that had been carrying the weight of human history for longer than any living person could remember. The Vatican sat on the far side of the Tiber from the main city, connected by the famous bridge of Sant'Angelo and guarded by the ancient cylindrical fortress of Castel Sant'Angelo, which had started life as the mausoleum of the Emperor Hadrian nearly 14 centuries before, and had been converted over the centuries into a fortress and a place of refuge for popes in danger. The popes who lived in the Vatican could see Castel Sant'Angelo from their windows, and in moments of political crisis, and there were many, its presence was a reminder of the practical limits of spiritual authority and the usefulness of having somewhere fortified to run. So tonight, let the candles dim in your imagination. Let the streets of Renaissance Rome grow quiet around you. Let the sounds of the city fade. And step with me, slowly and carefully, through the side door of history, the door the tour guides rarely open, the one that leads not to the chapels and the altars, but to the private rooms, the private meals, the private lives of the men who claim to speak for God on earth, and who in doing so revealed themselves to be magnificently, unavoidably, deeply human. Section 2. The Making of a Pope. Who these men were before the tiara. Before we can understand how these men lived once they reached the top, we should understand where they came from. Because what is striking, looking back at the Renaissance popes, is how ordinary or how unusually advantaged their origins were. These were not, for the most part, humble servants of God who rose through piety alone. They were men shaped by politics, by family, by money, and by a very practical understanding of how power worked in Renaissance Italy. The Catholic Church in this era was not simply a religious institution. It was the largest landowner in Italy. It controlled vast territories called the Papal States, stretching across central Italy. It had its own army, its own treasury, its own courts of law, its own diplomatic relationships with every king and emperor in Europe. Becoming pope was not just a spiritual appointment. It was assuming the throne of a medium-sized Italian state with enormous international influence, and the men who competed for that throne understood this perfectly.
Most of the great Renaissance popes came from noble Italian families: the Della Rovere, the Medici, the Borgia, the Piccolomini, the Barbo. These were dynasties that viewed the papacy as both a religious calling and a strategic asset. A pope from your family meant land grants, cardinal appointments, diplomatic advantages, and a share of the enormous wealth that flowed through the church. Ambitious fathers sent their sons into the clergy young, not because they were necessarily spiritual, but because the church was one of the few ladders a well-positioned young man could climb to the very highest levels of European power. Education was serious and thorough for these men. They studied theology, yes, but also law, philosophy, rhetoric, classical literature, and the political arts. Many of them were educated alongside the children of the most powerful families in Italy, in humanist academies that produced some of the greatest minds of the Renaissance. They learned Latin and Greek, they read Cicero and Virgil, they absorbed the ancient world and carried it forward into a very modern sense of personal ambition. The humanist education that shaped these men is worth pausing on for a moment, because it produced a peculiar and interesting kind of mind, a mind equally at home in the language of Scripture and the language of ancient Rome, equally capable of citing St. Paul and quoting Horace, equally committed, at least intellectually, to both the classical tradition and the Christian one. This dual inheritance gave the Renaissance papacy its peculiar cultural flavor, the sense that the Church was not merely managing the spiritual affairs of Europe, but was itself the inheritor and custodian of the entire weight of Western civilization.
Young men destined for the Church,
entered it young. A boy from a powerful family might be tonsured, given the ritual haircut that marked entrance into the clerical state as early as 7 or 8 years old. He would begin his education in the classics and theology. He would be trained in Latin to the point where it was nearly a native language. He would learn the rituals and ceremonies of the church from the inside, absorbing them as a lived reality rather than an external imposition. By the time such a young man was in his 20s and beginning to move upward through the church hierarchy, he had been in formation for his entire conscious life. The transition from cardinal to pope was in many ways less dramatic than it might appear from the outside. The conclave, the locked assembly of cardinals that elected each new pope, was an institution designed to produce a decision, and it sometimes took agonizing lengths of time to produce one. Cardinals were locked inside together, sometimes for weeks, sometimes in summer heat that made the experience genuinely unpleasant. Food was restricted as the deliberations dragged on the theory that a hungry cardinal might be more willing to compromise. Alliances formed and broke and reformed. The politics of the conclave were the politics of a very enclosed world, in which every person present had spent their entire career understanding exactly this kind of pressure and exactly this kind of calculation.
The path from young cleric to pope ran through the College of Cardinals, a body of senior church officials who elected each new pope in a process called a conclave. These elections were not always peaceful or particularly holy. Votes were bought, deals were struck, promises were made in whispered conversations in the dim halls outside the locked voting chamber. The word simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was not a secret scandal, but an open practice that most people in the church accepted as simply how things worked. Rodrigo Borgia, who would become Pope Alexander VI, reportedly spent enormous sums securing promises of support before his election in 1492. Whether this constituted outright bribery depends on whom you ask, and most of the people in a position to ask at the time were themselves engaged in similar transactions. The moment of election was a genuine transformation in one very specific sense. The elected man was asked if he accepted the office, and if he said yes, he ceased to be a cardinal and became the pope. Everything changed in that single assent. The white robes replaced the red. The ring of the fisherman was placed on his finger. The triple crown, the tiara, was brought out, though many popes preferred not to wear it regularly because it was extremely heavy. He was carried through the streets of Rome in a procession that drew enormous crowds, and those crowds looked up at him with a mixture of religious awe and simple human curiosity about who this new man was and what he would do. Once elected, a new pope did not step into his role as a blank slate. He stepped in as himself, with his family loyalties, his personal preferences, his old friendships and old grudges, his appetites and his fears. The tiara and the white robes changed the form, but not always the content. The man who had been cardinal with a taste for hunting parties and fine wine did not necessarily surrender those tastes when he became pope. He simply moved them into a larger and more opulent setting, surrounded by more servants, under a higher ceiling, with greater resources and fewer people willing to say anything about it. This is where the private life begins, not in the moment of great spiritual transformation, but in the quiet continuation of a very particular human personality.
the Pope was still a man, and men, as it turns out, are remarkably consistent, regardless of the height of their throne. Section 3. The Apostolic Palace, their private home. Before we go any further, a small and important pause. If this slow walk through history is easing your mind and helping you drift towards sleep, I would love it if you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. This is Heyo, Boring History for Sleep, and we are on our way to 1,000 subscribers, that first big milestone that means so much to a small channel like this. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through the past, your subscription genuinely helps us keep going. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is on your clock. And if you have a little sleepy hype left in you, send it our way. It is always welcome here. Now, back to Rome. The Apostolic Palace in the Vatican is not one building, it is a complex. A sprawling, growing, constantly being renovated maze of interconnected structures that expanded over centuries as each new pope added something, removed something, or simply decided the existing rooms were not grand enough for a man of his stature. By the Renaissance, it was an enormous compound of halls, chapels, libraries, audience rooms, gardens, courtyards, apartments, and hidden staircases that could take a new employee weeks to fully understand. The Pope's private apartments occupied several floors of this complex, and they were decorated with an intensity of ambition that takes a moment to fully absorb. Imagine waking up each morning in a room whose walls have been painted by Raphael. Imagine walking from your bedroom to your study through a corridor lined with frescoes of classical mythology and biblical scenes, rendered in colors so vivid they seem to vibrate in morning light. Imagine sitting at your breakfast table beneath a ceiling in which cherubs and saints and allegorical figures swirl in gold and cobalt and rose. This was not decoration. This was a statement. Every surface in the papal apartments said, in the visual language of the Renaissance, that the man who lived here was the most powerful figure in Christendom. The rooms themselves were numerous. There were formal reception halls for greeting ambassadors and kings, large enough to hold hundreds of people. There were smaller audience chambers where the Pope made cardinals and bishops in more private settings. There was a library stocked with manuscripts and books, many of them priceless, that the more scholarly popes spent considerable time in. There were chapels, private ones, where the Pope could pray alone or with a small circle of close attendants, separate from the great public masses in St. Peter's Basilica. And there were the truly private rooms, the bedroom, the dressing room, the small antechambers where the Pope ate his most informal meals, where he received his closest friends and family, where he was, as much as he ever was, simply himself. The bedroom of a Renaissance Pope was not what a modern person might imagine when they think of a private room. It was not small or simple or retreating. It was a sizable chamber, typically hung with rich textiles, tapestries on the walls, heavy silk or damask curtains around the bed itself, oriental rugs on the stone floor. The bed was enormous by the standards of the age, raised on a platform, with a carved wooden headboard and multiple layers of mattress stuffed with feathers, topped with fine linen sheets and heavy coverings. The room typically had a fireplace, which burned from autumn through late spring in Rome's climate, and several pieces of substantial furniture. Chests for clothing and valuables, chairs, a writing table. Candles provided light after dark, dozens of them in silver or gilt candlesticks arranged around the room. The smell of beeswax candles and fresh flowers, and the particular mineral smell of old stone walls would have been constant. Beside the bedroom was typically a small dressing room, where the Pope's clothing was kept and where he was dressed each morning by his personal chamberlains. Dressing a Pope in the Renaissance was a carefully choreographed ritual. The Pope wore a white cassock as his daily habit, the plain garment that is still the standard papal dress today. Over this went various additional layers depending on the occasion, from the simple addition of a white succhetto on the head for informal moments to the full ceremonial vestments for mass and public appearances, elaborate copes embroidered with gold thread, mitres decorated with precious stones, the papal stole, the pallium. Each layer had to be arranged correctly, and the men who dressed the Pope each morning were highly trained in the protocol of these arrangements.
The household staff of a Renaissance Pope was immense. Estimates vary, but during the papacy of Leo X, there were reportedly close to 700 servants working in the papal household. This included everyone from the highest-ranking chamberlains who managed the Pope's personal schedule and belongings, to the secretaries who handled his correspondence, to the doorkeepers who stood outside his private rooms, to the cooks, the servers, the launderers, the stable hands, the gardeners, and the various artists, musicians, and entertainers who were kept on retainer for the entertainment of the court. The Vatican was not just a residence, it was a small city. The chamberlain was the most important of the personal attendants, the man responsible for managing the Pope's private life in all its practical dimensions. He controlled access to the private apartments, organized the daily schedule, managed the personal finances, and served as the first and most consistent human presence in the Pope's immediate environment. Being a papal chamberlain was an enormously powerful position because access to the Pope's private person was itself a form of power, and the chamberlain was its gatekeeper. These men were chosen with great care and typically served with tremendous loyalty. They were among the very few people who saw the Pope consistently in his most unguarded moments, not performing, not presiding, just existing. Security was provided by the Swiss Guard, established by Pope Julius II in 1506. These soldiers, recruited from the Swiss cantons, wore distinctive uniforms in yellow and blue and red, colors that have barely changed in 500 years. They were formidably trained and fiercely loyal, serving as both ceremonial bodyguards and genuine military protection in an era when popes had real enemies who sometimes meant them real harm. Julius, who had accumulated an extraordinary number of enemies over a long political career, had particular reason to appreciate their presence. The Swiss Guard stood at the doors of the private apartments day and night, and the sight of their halberds gleaming in the torchlight was one of the constant visual features of life in the Vatican. They were part of the background, like the stone walls, noticed only when you thought about them, but always there. The gardens of the Vatican were a refuge. They were meticulously maintained, fragrant with roses and herbs and citrus trees, laid out in the geometric patterns that Renaissance landscape designers favored, order imposed on nature, which felt like a fitting metaphor for the whole enterprise. The popes walked there, alone or with a small retinue, in the early mornings or the cool hours of the late afternoon. It was one of the few places where the constant press of duty and ceremony and performance relaxed its grip slightly.
the sound of a fountain in a Vatican garden at dawn, the smell of wet earth and new roses, the birdsong from the citrus trees. These are things that even the most world-wearied of men might find briefly restorative.
Among the garden's more unusual residents during the papacy of Leo X was a white elephant named Hanno, a gift from the King of Portugal, who became one of the most talked-about characters in all of Rome. But we will get to Hanno in due time. Section 4. The Daily Rhythm, Morning to Night in the Vatican. The days of the Renaissance Pope had a structure, though how rigidly that structure was followed depended enormously on the particular man wearing the tiara. Some popes were meticulous in their habits, rising early, attending to their religious duties first, receiving visitors in careful order, and maintaining a schedule that would have impressed a German clockmaker. Others were considerably more flexible, rising when they felt like it, receiving whatever visitors they chose, and organizing their days around their personal preferences rather than any fixed routine. Generally speaking, the morning began with prayer. A pope was, after all, the head of the Catholic Church, and whatever his private failings, the outward observance of religious practice was both spiritually expected and politically necessary. Morning Mass was a daily requirement, celebrated either in one of the Vatican's private chapels or, on more formal occasions, in a grander setting with an assembled audience of clergy and courtiers. The Pope said his prayers in Latin, as he had been trained to do since childhood, in the rolling cadences of liturgical language that had barely changed in 1,000 years. For men who had been raised inside the Church, the Latin of the liturgy was not a foreign language, but a native one, a language of the interior life, of memory, of the earliest patterns of religious experience. Saying the words of the Mass was, for many of these men, an act that connected them to the deepest layers of who they were, regardless of whatever else was also true about them. After the religious duties came the administrative ones. A pope in the Renaissance was also, never forget, the ruler of a territorial state and the head of an international institution with tendrils reaching into every kingdom in Europe. The morning was typically given over to paperwork, an unromantic word for what was actually an enormous volume of correspondence, petitions, decrees, diplomatic communications, financial accounts, and legal decisions. Secretaries were essential figures in the papal household, the quiet, quick-thinking men who managed the flow of documents and ensured that the right papers reached the Pope's desk at the right moment, and that his responses were properly recorded and dispatched. Some of the correspondence was genuinely significant. Letters to and from kings and emperors, dispatches about military campaigns, communications with the great councils of the Church in France, Germany, England, Spain. A letter from the Pope carried enormous weight in the political world of the Renaissance. It could make a king nervous or reassure him. It could settle a theological dispute that had been simmering for years, or ignite one that would run for decades. The men who drafted these letters, and it was usually the secretaries, working from the Pope's spoken thoughts and general instructions, understood the weight of what they were composing, and they chose words with corresponding care. Audiences followed, the formal receptions at which ambassadors, bishops, noblemen, and occasionally ordinary supplicants presented themselves before the Pope and made their requests or delivered their news.
Papal audiences in the Renaissance were highly choreographed affairs, governed by elaborate rules of protocol that dictated everything from how visitors should dress and how deeply they should bow, to the precise distance at which they should stand while speaking, and how they should address the pontiff. Getting the protocol wrong was embarrassing at best and politically damaging at worst. The audience chamber was itself a carefully designed space. The Pope sat on a raised throne, literally elevated above his visitors, and the effect was entirely intentional. Height was hierarchy made physical. The visitor who entered the room had to cross a considerable floor of polished marble or stone before reaching the place where he might speak, and every step of that crossing was a small, accumulated experience of his own relative smallness. The ambassadors and nobles who navigated these audiences were sophisticated people who understood the theatre of it perfectly and played their part skillfully. And the Pope on his throne understood his role with equal sophistication. It was performance, yes, but it was performance in service of very real power, and both parties knew it. The midday meal was taken in the early afternoon, and it was typically the main meal of the day. The Pope did not always eat alone. More often, he dined with a small circle of close associates, cardinals, secretaries, trusted friends, in a setting that, depending on the Pope, could range from a relatively modest private room to an elaborately staged banquet hall. The food itself was extraordinary by the standards of any era. Renaissance papal kitchens employed skilled cooks who drew on the best ingredients available in Rome's markets, supplemented by gifts of food that arrived constantly from noble families and foreign courts seeking papal favor. We will look at those meals in much closer detail in a later section.
After the midday meal came the siesta. This was not a peculiarity of any individual pope, but a fairly universal feature of the Roman day, a period of rest in the early afternoon, when the heat of the Roman sun was most intense, and when even the most energetic men of affairs lay down and let the world pause for an hour or two. The Vatican was quieter in these afternoon hours. The corridors emptied, the great doors of the audience chambers closed. Somewhere behind them, the Vicar of Christ was taking a nap. There is something quietly remarkable about this detail. The most powerful religious figure in the Western world, the man who claimed spiritual authority over the souls of millions of people, observed the Italian siesta. He lay down on his great feathered bed in his painted room and closed his eyes and rested, just like the merchant in the street below, and the cook in the kitchen 3 floors down, and the Swiss guard dozing slightly in his chair outside the closed door. The papacy did not suspend the body's need for sleep. Nothing does. Afternoons were often given over to more private pursuits. This is when a pope who loved hunting would slip out of the city with a small retinue to the fields and forests outside Rome. This is when a pope who loved books would retreat to his library. This is when informal meetings happened, conversations with trusted advisors, private audiences with friends or family members, and, in some cases, visits to or from companions whose relationship to the Pope was rather more personal than any official record was likely to acknowledge.
The afternoon light in Rome in summer is long and golden and very warm, and the Vatican in those hours must have had a particular quality. The business of the morning concluded, the evening's performances not yet begun, the stone corridors cool and dim, while outside the sun beat down on the ancient rooftops of the city. In these hours, if you were privileged enough to be walking those corridors, you might have heard music from a distant room, or laughter, or the sound of a man speaking in quiet conversation with someone he trusted. These are the sounds that the official record does not preserve. Evening Mass or evening prayers brought the day back to its religious framework. Then came supper, usually lighter than the midday meal, and the evening entertainments that characterized the more festive papal courts. Music, readings, theatrical performances, the recitation of poetry, the playing of games. The halls of the Vatican in the evenings, especially during the more exuberant pontificates, could be surprisingly lively places, full of conversation and laughter, and the sounds of lutes and viols threading through the warm night air. Bedtime for a Renaissance pope came when he chose, which again varied considerably by individual, and as the candle in the private bedchamber was finally extinguished, the most powerful man in Christendom lay down on his feather mattress, beneath silk hangings, and faced, as all human beings face in the darkness, whatever private thoughts the day had left unresolved. The prayers he had said in the morning were already old by then. The decisions made in the audience chamber felt distant. What remained was the man himself, breathing, thinking, remembering, hoping, fearing, altogether human, altogether alone with whatever he understood himself to be. If you want to understand the Renaissance papacy at its most dramatically human, there is no better starting point than Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI in 1492. He was 61 years old at his election, already a man of enormous experience, enormous wealth, and an enormous personal life that he had conducted with a remarkable lack of secrecy over the preceding 4 decades. He had been born in Spain, in the city of Xàtiva near Valencia, into a noble family with strong connections to the church. His uncle Alonso Borgia became Pope Calixtus III, and it was this family connection that launched Rodrigo's career in the church before he had reached his 20s. He rose quickly. Cardinal at 25, Vice-Chancellor of the Church, one of the most powerful administrative positions in the Vatican, by his late 20s. He held this position for an astonishing 35 years, accumulating wealth and influence with a consistency that suggested a man who understood exactly what he was doing and never lost sight of his goal. He was charming, energetic, intelligent, politically gifted, and possessed of physical appetites that he indulged with very little apparent anxiety about what his priestly vows might have to say on the subject. Even before he became Pope, Rodrigo's personal life attracted comment. As early as 1460, when he was in his late 20s, Pope Pius II wrote him a letter that has survived, rebuking him sharply for attending a private garden party in Siena that had reportedly descended into behavior unbecoming of a churchman. Rodrigo denied the worst of the accusations, but the letter itself, with its specific and detailed complaints from the Pope, tells us something important. Even at the beginning of his career, Rodrigo Borgia's enjoyment of life was visible enough to draw official attention. What this tells us is that Alexander VI was not simply a man who abandoned his principles upon assuming the highest office in the church. He was a man who had been himself, consistently, openly, unapologetically himself, throughout an entire career in the church, rising through it and eventually to its apex, while remaining the same person he had always been. This is a different kind of story from the tale of a good man corrupted by power. It is the story of a particular kind of man finding a particular kind of accommodation with a system that tolerated, or at least did not prevent, exactly the kind of life he wanted to live.
Rodrigo's most enduring relationship was with a woman named Vanozza de Catani, a Roman noblewoman of considerable character and resilience. Their affair began around 1470 and lasted for many years, producing 4 children whom Rodrigo acknowledged openly and loved with what appears to have been genuine paternal warmth. Their names were Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Joffre, children who would go on to live lives of such spectacular drama that the name Borgia became synonymous with the most lurid extremes of Renaissance ambition. Cesare Borgia became a military commander whose ruthlessness inspired Machiavelli's The Prince. Lucrezia Borgia was married off 3 times to powerful men as a tool of papal diplomacy, though history has greatly exaggerated her wickedness. Juan met an unpleasant end in the Tiber River. Only Joffre lived into a relatively quiet old age. Vanozza de Catani is a figure who deserves more careful attention than she usually receives. She was not a passive figure in Alexander's story. She was a woman of independent means who managed property and businesses in Rome and maintained her social position throughout a long life that extended well past Alexander's death. She had, over the years of her relationship with Rodrigo, been officially married 3 times to different men, an arrangement that provided the children with nominal legal fathers, while everyone in Rome, including apparently the husbands in question, understood the actual paternity. She outlived Alexander by many years, dying in 1518, and she remained a respected figure in Roman society throughout. She made charitable contributions, attended Mass regularly, and was remembered in the city not primarily as a pope's mistress, but as a successful, capable woman in her own right. By the time Rodrigo became pope, his relationship with Vanozza had cooled, though he maintained friendly relations with her and continued to provide for the children. His new favorite was a young woman of breathtaking beauty named Julia Farnese, who was approximately 40 years his junior. Julia was married to a man named Orsino Orsini, but this did not appear to trouble anyone involved, least of all the Pope. She was called La Bella in Rome, which gives you some sense of how she was regarded. Her hair was reportedly of extraordinary beauty and length. Contemporary sources describe it in terms that suggest genuine admiration. And she was painted by Pinturicchio in the Borgia apartments, her features incorporated into a Madonna in a way that was simultaneously devoted and slightly irreverent. Her brother Alessandro Farnese was made a cardinal, and the Romans had a nickname for him that mixed respect and mockery in equal measure, the Petticoat Cardinal. Alessandro would eventually become Pope Paul III, one of the architects of the Catholic Reformation. The Farnese family's rise owed no small debt to his sister's relationship with Alexander VI.
What was life like for Alexander in his private rooms? By all accounts, he was a man of great personal warmth and sociability, deeply devoted to his children, fond of good food and music and dancing. He hosted magnificent entertainments at the Vatican and enjoyed them with evident pleasure. He was not a brooding or melancholy figure. He was, by temperament, an enjoyer of life, a man who moved through the world with energy and appetite, and a quality that contemporaries described as charm, and that his enemies described as seductiveness. When he laughed, people noticed. When he entered a room, people noticed.
He had the kind of presence that is difficult to account for rationally and impossible to ignore. His relationship with his children went beyond the political. He loved them. This is documented in his private correspondence, in the testimony of people who observed him with them, in the specific personal nature of the decisions he made on their behalf. He worried about Cesare's health during a serious illness in the early years of the papacy. He wept publicly when Juan's body was recovered from the Tiber in 1497. He wrote letters to Lucrezia that go beyond the formal language of diplomatic instruction into something that reads across 500 years as the voice of a father trying to ensure his daughter's happiness in circumstances that were often not designed with her happiness in mind.
The famous or infamous Banquet of Chestnuts, said to have taken place in the Vatican in 1501, is one of those historical episodes that teeters perpetually between fact and legend. It was recorded by Johann Burchard, the master of ceremonies of the papal court, who kept a detailed diary of events at the Vatican. Burchard described an evening of considerable licentiousness in the Borgia apartments. Historians have argued extensively about whether his account was accurate, exaggerated, or partially invented, and the truth is probably somewhere in the complicated middle, which is where the truth usually lives when history is recorded by someone with a particular perspective on the people being described. What is important to note is that Burchard was not a Borgia enemy. He was an official of the papal court, a precise and somewhat humorless German cleric, whose diary is generally considered reliable for the routine events it records. That he described unusual things happening in the Borgia apartments on particular occasions does not mean the most extreme versions of those events are accurate, but it does mean something was going on that warranted recording.
What is less disputed is that Alexander kept his children close, used the papacy aggressively to advance their interests, and presided over a Vatican court that mixed high culture with low morality in a way that shocked some contemporaries and delighted others. He was a complicated man in a complicated role, and the decades of his papacy, whatever their moral failures, were also marked by genuine political skill. He kept the papal states intact, balanced the competing powers of France and Spain, and navigated some of the most treacherous waters of Renaissance Italian politics without losing either his throne or his life. That, in that particular world, was no small achievement. He died in August of 1503, following a sudden illness, at the age of 72. The cause of death remains debated. Malaria is the most likely explanation, though rumors of poison circulated immediately, as they always did when powerful figures died suddenly in Renaissance Italy. His son Cesare was also gravely ill at the same time, suggesting something environmental rather than targeted. But legends, once born, are reluctant to die. Section 6. Julius the Second, the warrior who slept in armor. If Alexander VI was the most sensational of the Renaissance popes, Giuliano della Rovere, who became Pope Julius II in 1503, was perhaps the most formidable. He was 60 years old when he was elected, a man who had spent his entire adult life in the political and military trenches of the Renaissance Church, surviving the Borgia papacy, during which he had prudently fled Rome and spent a decade in self-imposed exile, and returning to claim the throne with the air of someone who felt the whole establishment owed him something for his patience. Julius the Second is remembered by history under two rather different lights. The first is the warrior pope, the man who strapped on armor and personally led military campaigns to reclaim papal states that had slipped from church control, who was present on battlefields in his 70s, who was feared and respected by the secular rulers of Europe as a genuine military and political force. He besieged cities, he formed alliances and broke them. He drove the French out of northern Italy with a combination of military force, diplomatic cunning, and a ferocious personal willpower that seemed to increase rather than diminish as he aged. His contemporaries, not easily impressed, were genuinely impressed. The second light is the great patron. Julius commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He hired Raphael to decorate his private apartments in the Apostolic Palace, rooms that still bear Raphael's incomparable frescoes and still carry the name the Raphael Rooms in his honor. He began the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, a project that consumed enormous resources and more than a century of construction, but produced the most recognizable church on earth. He founded the Vatican museums, reportedly because he was so moved by a newly discovered ancient statue, the Laocoon, that he wanted a place to keep and display great works for posterity. He was, in short, one of the most consequential art patrons in human history. But who was Julius in private? The answer is more complicated and more interesting than either of these images suggests.
He had a temper. This is well documented by every source that got close to him. He shouted, he raged, he threw things. He beat people with his staff when they annoyed him sufficiently. Michelangelo, who worked closely with him on the Sistine Chapel ceiling project, and who was himself not a man of mild disposition, found the relationship extremely trying at times. Julius wanted the ceiling faster than Michelangelo was willing to go. He climbed the scaffolding to check on progress. He threatened, he cajoled, he demanded. The two men were magnificently incompatible in temperament and magnificently well matched in stubbornness, and the friction between them probably contributed to the ceiling being as extraordinary as it is. When you push a genius past the point of comfort, sometimes you get something beyond what comfort would have produced. Julius also had a quality that his admirers noted and his enemies sometimes grudgingly acknowledged. He cared. He cared intensely about the papacy as an institution, about Rome as a city, about the Church's place in the world. His military campaigns were not merely self-aggrandizement. They were, in his understanding, necessary to preserve the independence of the papal states from the competing imperial powers that might otherwise have absorbed them. His artistic patronage was not merely vanity. It was, in his understanding, the proper way for the Pope of Christendom to mark his epoch, to make Rome the center of the world's cultural and spiritual life, to create something permanent that would outlast any individual's tenure. This distinction between ambition and vision is difficult to draw clearly in any individual case, and Julius himself probably could not have drawn it cleanly. But the quality of his caring, its intensity and its consistency, suggests that whatever drove him was more than mere ego. It was a vocation, understood in the most demanding sense of that word. Julius had also fathered children before becoming pope. He had at least 3 daughters, born to unknown mothers, in the years before his elevation to the papacy. He was not, in his earlier life, a man who prioritized the celibate ideal. Whether this continued after his election is less clear. What is clear is that his private life in the Vatican was dominated not by romance or family, but by the relentless press of his ambitions.
He was a man consumed by his vision for the papacy and for Rome, and there is something both admirable and lonely about the portrait that emerges. He reportedly refused to live in the apartments that Alexander VI had occupied, saying he would not sleep in rooms desecrated by the Borgias. He had Raphael cover over whatever remained of Borgia decoration with new frescoes. He was not simply redecorating, he was making a statement that a new era had begun, that the corruption and scandal of the Borgia years was being painted over, literally and symbolically, with something cleaner and more dignified. In his final years, Julius suffered from gout and other ailments with characteristic obstinacy, refusing to let physical limitations slow him down to any more than the minimum degree. He died in February of 1513, having been pope for nearly a decade, leaving behind a Rome that was physically and artistically transformed, and a church that was simultaneously more powerful and more in need of reform than it had been when he arrived. The day he died, Romans reportedly wept. Whatever they thought of him as a politician or a spiritual leader, they understood that something irreplaceable had passed. And they were right. And they were right.
Giovanni de' Medici was the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the great Florentine ruler and patron whose name is almost synonymous with the Italian Renaissance. Growing up in the Medici household in Florence meant growing up surrounded by the greatest artists, philosophers, and humanists of the age. Young Giovanni was a childhood friend of Michelangelo, who practiced his sculpting in the Medici gardens. He was educated by the finest tutors in Italy. He learned Greek from the scholar Poliziano. He discussed philosophy with members of the Platonic Academy. By the time he was a teenager, he had already been exposed to more of the world's beauty and learning than most people encountered in a lifetime. He became a cardinal at 13, technically too young, which is why the appointment was kept secret for a period, through the considerable exertion of Medici family influence. By 16, he was old enough to officially take up his position in the College of Cardinals and move to Rome. He was expelled from Florence in 1494 when the Medici were overthrown, spent years in exile wandering through Europe and developing an increasingly refined understanding of power and culture, and returned to Italy in time to be present at the conclave that elected him pope in 1513. He was 37 years old. He was said to be physically unprepossessing, short, somewhat heavy, with large, myopic eyes that struggled to see at any distance. He wore spectacles, which was itself a detail that contemporaries noted. He was not the image of a warrior or a statesman in the physical sense, but he was charming, learned, genuinely witty, and possessed of a social confidence that came from having been raised as the most distinguished young man in the most distinguished city in Italy. He was entirely comfortable at the center of a crowd. And under Leo X, the Vatican became exactly that, the center of a crowd, the largest, most glamorous, most artistically distinguished crowd in Europe. The papal household swelled to nearly 700 servants. The papal apartments were filled with music at almost all hours. Leo genuinely loved music, and he maintained a permanent choir and ensemble, but performed throughout the day. He loved theatre and organized elaborate performances of classical plays and new compositions. He invited the best poets of Italy to Rome and paid them handsomely to remain. Raphael continued his work on the Vatican apartments and took on additional commissions. The rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica accelerated. And then were the feasts.
Leo X's banquets were legendary in his own lifetime and have not dimmed with the centuries. He hosted dinners at which dishes were served that most of his guests had never encountered and would never encounter again. Peacock tongues were a delicacy that appeared on his table. Pies were sometimes baked with live birds inside, a theatrical touch that produced startled gasps from the assembled guests when the crust was broken and the birds flew out into the great hall. There were dishes made from animals imported from North Africa. There were desserts sculpted to look like buildings or famous works of art. There was wine from every corner of Europe. The entertaining was not solely about pleasure, though Leo clearly took pleasure in it. It was also a form of political theatre. Hosting the most spectacular court in Europe was a way of projecting papal power in an era when power was partly measured by magnificence. The people who sat at Leo's table went home and talked about it for years. They told their rulers, they told their friends. The reputation of the Vatican as a center of culture and wealth spread outward from those candle-lit dining halls like ripples from a stone dropped in still water.
Leo also had a pet elephant. This deserves its own moment of attention. The elephant, named Hanno, was a gift from King Manuel I of Portugal, delivered to Rome in 1514 as part of an exotic diplomatic embassy. Hanno was an albino elephant, or at least very pale, and he caused a sensation in Rome the moment he arrived. Leo was enchanted. Hanno was installed in the Vatican gardens, fed on sugarcane and other delicacies, and paraded at official occasions to the delight of crowds. The elephant learned to bow before the Pope. He could perform simple tricks. When Raphael was asked to paint a memorial of Hanno after the elephant died in 1516, the result was a fresco on a Vatican wall that Leo X reportedly wept before. He had genuinely loved that elephant. But the extravagance had consequences. Leo X spent money at a rate that was genuinely alarming, even by the standards of Renaissance papal courts. The papal treasury, which Julius II had left in reasonable condition despite his military campaigns, was depleted with extraordinary speed. To fund the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica and maintain his court at its accustomed level of splendor, Leo authorized the aggressive sale of indulgences, payments made to the Church in exchange for the remission of sin. It was not a new practice, but the scale and the crudeness with which it was conducted in Leo's time went far beyond anything that had come before. In Germany, a preacher named Johann Tetzel travelled from town to town selling these indulgences with a jingle that went something like, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." It was glib and transactional and deeply offensive to a significant number of serious Christians. One of them was an Augustinian monk and theology professor named Martin Luther, who in October of 1517 composed a series of arguments, traditionally said to number 95, challenging the practice of indulgences and the theological foundations on which they rested. He made these arguments public, as was the custom for academic disputes. It was an act that, in ways Leo X probably could not have imagined from the splendor of his Vatican court, changed the world. The Protestant Reformation, which would split Western Christianity permanently, had roots in many places and many grievances, but the immediate spark, the incident that lit the fuse, was directly connected to Leo's desperate need for money to pay for his magnificent parties and his even more magnificent building programs. The man who had said, "Let us enjoy it," had, in his enjoyment, inadvertently upended the religious order of Europe. History rarely lacks for irony. Section 8. The art they commissioned, vanity, devotion, or both.
This is a question worth lingering over, because the art of the Renaissance papacy is so extraordinary, so permanent, so woven into the fabric of human civilization, that it is easy to look at it and see only the beauty. But behind every commission was a person with a reason, and the reasons were rarely simple.
When Julius the Second stood before Michelangelo and demanded that the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel be painted, what was driving that demand? It was partly religious. Julius genuinely believed that the most sacred space in Christendom should be adorned with the most powerful art that human hands could produce. It was partly ego. The Sistine Chapel was associated with his family, his uncle Pope Sixtus IV having built it decades before, and Julius wanted his pontificate to be marked by a contribution at least equal in scale. It was partly political. A magnificent Vatican was a demonstration of papal power to the entire world. And it was partly, one suspects, an instinct for beauty that transcended any single motivation and was simply a feature of the man's inner life. Michelangelo worked on the Sistine Chapel ceiling for 4 years, from 1508 to 1512, lying on his back on the scaffolding in conditions of physical torment that he documented in his letters and in a darkly comic poem he wrote about it. His neck ached permanently. Paint dripped into his face. The light was wrong. The Pope was impossible. And at the end of those 4 years, he had produced something that has no equal in the history of Western art. 300 figures across more than 5,000 square feet of ceiling, depicting the story of humanity from the creation of the world through the fall and the flood, and the slow, anguished, hopeful journey towards God.
Julius never lived to see the full project completed. He died in 1513, the year the chapel was dedicated. But he had seen enough. And whatever complicated mixture of vanity and devotion and political calculation had originally motivated the commission, the thing that was created transcended all of it. Raphael's work in the papal apartments, the Stanza della Segnatura, the Stanza di Eliodoro, and the other rooms, is equally remarkable. The rooms were Julius's private library and reception spaces, and Raphael painted them with a program of images that connected the Pope's personal identity to the highest traditions of classical philosophy and Christian theology. The School of Athens, painted in the Stanza della Segnatura, gathers the great thinkers of the ancient world, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Pythagoras, in a magnificent imagined hall, and suggests that the wisdom of antiquity finds its natural continuation in the Rome of Julius II. It is an image of breathtaking intellectual ambition, and it was placed in the room where the Pope kept his books and received his closest associates. Leo X continued Raphael's work after Julius died, and under his patronage, Rome became the cultural capital of the world. He kept Michelangelo working on various projects. He maintained an academy of classical learning. He collected manuscripts, objects, ancient coins, gems. The Vatican under Leo was as much a museum as a palace, though the word museum would not quite have applied. Everything was alive and in use, surrounded by the constant human activity of a great court. What did these popes feel walking through these rooms? What passed through Alexander VI's mind when he moved through apartments painted for him with religious and mythological scenes? What did Julius think when he first saw the completed Raphael rooms, those images of himself embedded in the history of the Church and the philosophy of the ancient world? We cannot know precisely, but we can guess that the experience was not simply visual. Art on that scale, in that setting, done by those hands, must have created an atmosphere that even the most worldly of men would have found difficult to remain entirely unmoved by. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps in commissioning all of this beauty, these popes were doing something that the purely political explanation does not fully capture. Perhaps they were building an architecture of meaning, a world so charged with significance and beauty that even the man who lived in it, the man who knew all its secrets and all its human contradictions, might occasionally feel something genuinely transcendent. Art as a kind of private spiritual practice for men who had perhaps lost faith in the institutional version of the thing it depicted. Section 9. Love, Lust and Loneliness. The question of celibacy.
Celibacy was a requirement of the priesthood in the medieval and Renaissance Catholic Church. It was also, during this particular era, somewhat theoretical in practice. This is not a delicate way of putting it. It is simply true. The Renaissance papacy included men who had children, men who had long-term mistresses, men who were rumored to have male companions, and men who managed the outward form of celibacy while engaging in what a generous observer might call close friendships with particular individuals who lived near them and accompanied them everywhere. This was not a hidden scandal in the sense of something that everyone pretended was not happening. It was known, it was discussed, it was criticized by reformers and satirized by writers. Erasmus wrote about the corruption of the clergy with a cutting wit that made readers across Europe nod in recognition. Other writers were less polite. The gap between the official ideal of celibacy and the lived reality of the Renaissance Church was so wide that people had largely stopped expecting it to be otherwise. Alexander VI, as we have discussed, was the most open about his private life. He did not pretend. He acknowledged his children. He housed his mistresses in proximity to the Vatican. He brought his family to Rome and integrated them into papal politics with a directness that startled even contemporaries accustomed to nepotism. But he was not unique in kind, only in degree. Julius the Second had fathered at least 3 daughters before becoming pope. Various other Renaissance popes were rumored or accused of relationships that the Church would not have sanctioned. The word rumored is important here. Renaissance Rome was a city of gossip, satire, and political mudslinging, and accusations against powerful figures should always be read with some awareness that they may have been exaggerated or invented by enemies. But even making allowances for this, the picture that emerges is of a celibacy requirement that was widely and regularly not observed. What is interesting to think about is what this meant for these men emotionally. The relationships with Vanozza dei Catani and Giulia Farnese clearly provided Alexander with genuine human warmth. Relationships that, however theologically complicated, also offered companionship, pleasure, and, in the case of his children, a form of love that appears to have been sincere and deep. He wept when his son Juan was murdered. He was proud of Caesar's ambitions, even when those ambitions terrified others. He arranged Lucrezia's marriages with a father's combination of strategic calculation and personal hope for her happiness. These were the emotional textures of a real family life, conducted inside the strange golden cage of the papacy. What about the popes who did not have these relationships, or who had them less openly? There is a particular quality of loneliness that seems to have haunted some of the figures at the top of the church hierarchy. The papacy, for all its magnificence and all its power, was in many respects an enormously isolated position. You were never truly private. Every word you spoke in public was weighted with institutional significance. Every relationship you formed was filtered through the politics of who the other person was and what they might want from you. Even the people who loved you,
And popes were loved by their families, by their close associates, by the artists and scholars who found in them a generous patron, loved you in the context of your power, which made it difficult to be entirely certain what the love was really about. Julius the Second, for all his ferocity, seems to have been a man who found genuine connection in his relationships with the artists he patronized. His interactions with Michelangelo, stormy as they were, had a quality of mutual recognition about them. Two enormously difficult, enormously talented men circling each other with a mixture of frustration and respect that sometimes resembles in the historical record something almost like affection. Julius climbed the Sistine scaffolding to argue with Michelangelo. He could have sent a secretary. He went himself. There is something in that personal involvement that suggests more than administrative oversight. Section 10. Nepotism. Family above all else.
If there is a single theme that runs through every aspect of Renaissance papal governance, it is the overwhelming priority of family. The word nepotism actually comes from this era. It derives from the Italian word nipote, meaning nephew, because popes so consistently and shamelessly promoted their nephews into positions of church power that the practice became permanently associated with the word for nephew. The logic was not simply greed, though greed was certainly a component. The logic was also structural. A pope came to power through a particular network of alliances and loyalties, and the most reliable members of that network were his own family. You could trust your nephew more than you could trust a stranger. You could trust your brother's son not to betray you to your enemies because his fate was tied to yours. In a world where the alliances supporting a pontificate could collapse overnight and the enemies circling outside the Vatican walls were both numerous and dangerous, family was the most stable foundation a pope could build on.
Alexander VI elevated this to an art form. He made his son Cesare a cardinal, a position for which Cesare's subsequent career as a military commander and suspected murderer suggests he was not ideally suited temperamentally. He used Lucrezia's marriages to forge alliances with the great families of Italy and with the Kingdom of Naples. He gave his son Juan military commands. He arranged Geoffrey's marriage to an Aragonese princess to secure the Spanish connection. The Borgia family was woven into the fabric of Italian power with a deliberateness and a comprehensiveness that was breathtaking.
Leo X was equally thorough in his Medici promotions. His cousin Giulio was made Archbishop of Florence and Cardinal, becoming his closest advisor and eventually succeeding him as Pope Clement VII. His nephew Lorenzo was made Duke of Urbino. Other Medici relatives and allies were distributed through the church hierarchy with the casual efficiency of someone arranging furniture in a room they intend to live in for a long time. The famous mass creation of 31 new cardinals in 1517 is a case study in the mechanics of papal nepotism at scale. Leo created this enormous number of cardinals at once in the aftermath of a plot against his life, simultaneously filling the College of Cardinals with his allies and extracting the considerable fees that came with the appointments. It was politically brilliant and spiritually indefensible, and Leo probably did not spend very much time anguishing over the tension between those two assessments. Julius II was somewhat more restrained in the promotion of family, partly because his particular character was shaped by a determination to distinguish himself from his predecessors, and partly because his energies were focused outward, on the papacy itself, rather than on the Della Rovere family dynasty. He had nephews in the church, and he looked after them, but he was not primarily a dynastic pope. He was primarily a papal pope, a man who identified so completely with the institution he led that its aggrandizement and his own were essentially the same project. For ordinary Romans watching all of this, the feelings were mixed.
There was cynicism, certainly, the kind of weary cynicism that comes from watching powerful institutions openly contradict their own stated values. There was also, in some quarters, a dark humour about it. The satirical writing of the period is full of jokes about papal nepotism, about cardinal nephews who can barely read, about the going rate for church appointments, about the distance between the ideals of the Gospels and the realities of the Vatican. People laughed because the alternative was more painful than laughter. But there was also, underneath the cynicism and the laughter, a genuine and enduring faith that persisted even through all of this. The Church was corrupt in some of its human representatives. It was also the container for something that millions of people across Europe experienced as genuinely sacred. These two things coexisted, awkwardly and painfully, for as long as the Renaissance papacy lasted. Section 11. Food, feasts and private pleasures. Let us slow down for a moment and spend some time in the kitchens and the dining halls and the pleasure gardens of the Renaissance Vatican. Because the private pleasures of these popes are, in their way, one of the most vivid windows into what they were actually like as human beings. Food in the Renaissance papacy was not simply sustenance. It was theatre, politics, art and pleasure, all combined on a single groaning table. The papal kitchen, at its most active, was an enormous operation, employing dozens of cooks, undercooks, pastry specialists, confectioners, sauce makers, carvers and servers, all working in conditions of considerable heat and noise to produce the meals that kept the Vatican's social machinery running.
The ingredients available to the papal kitchen were extraordinary. Merchants and diplomats brought delicacies from across the known world. Spices from the East, sugar from North Africa, exotic fish from the Mediterranean, game birds from the forests of central Italy, fresh produce from the gardens of the Papal States. The papal table had access to virtually everything that the markets of Rome and the trade routes of Europe could provide, and the cooks who worked in that kitchen were skilled enough to do justice to their materials. Leo X's feasts were the stuff of contemporary legend. His love of food was genuine and extensive. The exotic dishes he served, peacock tongues, pies filled with live nightingales, elaborate sugar sculptures, were partly about showing off and partly about personal pleasure. He genuinely enjoyed good food in a direct, uncomplicated way. The elaborate theatre of the feast was something he participated in with evident delight, laughing at the live birds that burst from pies, marvelling at the confections his pastry cooks produced, entertaining his guests with the infectious enthusiasm of a man who loves a party. But the private meals were different from the public ones. When Leo or Julius or Alexander ate informally, with their secretaries, with a small circle of trusted companions, with family members in the more private apartments, the food was simpler and the atmosphere was different. This was when conversation happened, when the guards were relaxed, when the Pope could say what he thought rather than what was expected. The sources give us tantalizing glimpses of these more private table conversations, the offhand remarks, the expressions of personal opinion, the moments when the institutional mask slipped slightly and something more individual showed through. Hunting was another private pleasure, particularly associated with Julius the Second and Leo X. Julius hunted even as an old man, riding out from Rome into the countryside with his dogs and his falcons and a small retinue, in an activity that allowed him to be, temporarily, something other than the Pope. In the field, hunting was about skill and movement,
and the pleasure of being outdoors in the physical world, a pleasure that the stone corridors of the Vatican could not provide. Leo hunted with similar enthusiasm, taking extended trips that his attendants sometimes worried about, given his poor eyesight and the resulting risk that he might shoot something unintended. Music was a constant presence in Leo's Vatican and an important part of the daily life of several other Renaissance popes. The Vatican maintained professional choirs and ensembles, and the quality of music available in the papal apartments at any given moment was extremely high. Pope Leo himself was said to sing, not professionally, but with genuine pleasure. He could read music. He engaged in conversations with the best musicians of the age with the knowledgeable enthusiasm of a genuine lover of the art. Music for him was not background noise. It was a source of daily joy.
Chess was popular throughout the Vatican. The game had been in Europe since the Middle Ages and was considered appropriately intellectual for men of learning and rank. Cardinals played chess, popes played chess. The game provided a social occasion that was competitive without being physically demanding, intellectually stimulating, and long enough to fill an evening without exhausting a busy man. Gambling accompanied chess and other games in varying degrees. Leo X was known to be genuinely fond of wagering, a predilection that his more sober advisers occasionally found troubling. Theatre and dramatic performance were a particular feature of the Renaissance papal court at its most festive. Julius organized performances of classical Latin plays. Leo, who had grown up in the most artistically sophisticated household in Italy, encouraged Italian drama and pageantry on a grand scale. The Vatican at such moments was transformed, the great halls cleared and set with temporary staging and elaborate scenery, the assembled guests in their finest clothes, the torchlight and the music and the costumes creating an atmosphere of staged enchantment that was genuinely extraordinary. And through all of this, through the feasts and the hunts and the music and the theatre, the private man was revealed in small, specific ways, in the particular dish he reached for first, in the laugh he gave at a fool's jest, in the way he leaned toward a companion at the dinner table and lowered his voice to say something that was not meant for the full room. These are the moments that the official histories miss, and the diaries and the letters sometimes catch. And it is in these moments that these men become most fully real to us across the 500 years of distance.
There is also the question of what these popes drank. Wine was, of course, universal at the Renaissance table. Water in Rome was unreliable, and wine was both safer and more socially expected at every level of society. The papal cellar was stocked with wines from throughout Italy and from France and Spain, and the quality was exceptional. But there are records of individual popes having particular preferences. Julius the Second was said to be fond of the wines of his native Liguria, the coastal region of northwestern Italy, and to have had bottles brought to Rome at some expense. Leo X, with his broader and more eclectic tastes, was an enthusiast for wines from across the Italian peninsula, and was known to enjoy Malmsey, a sweet wine from the Mediterranean, with particular enthusiasm. These details, preserved in the account books of papal kitchens and the casual mentions of contemporary diarists, are among the smallest and most humanizing we have. A man who drinks a particular wine because it reminds him of somewhere he came from, or because he simply enjoys the taste, is a man you can almost reach across the centuries and understand. Section 12. The Weight of Conscience, Faith, Guilt, and Private Devotion. This is perhaps the hardest part of these men's inner lives to reconstruct, and in some ways the most important. We have talked about their pleasures, their families, their politics, their art. But what did they actually believe? And what did they feel about the distance between what they believed and how they lived? It would be tempting to conclude that Renaissance popes were simply hypocrites, men who wore the robes of faith while privately caring nothing for it. But the evidence does not support this tidy conclusion. The relationship these men had with their own faith was complicated, ambivalent, and deeply human. Most of them prayed, not just publicly and formally as was required, but privately, alone, in the small hours of the night and the early morning. The papal apartments contained private oratories, small, intimate chapel spaces where the Pope could pray without an audience. These rooms were used. The pattern of private prayer was part of the daily structure of life in the Vatican, even for popes whose public behavior was, to put it generously, inconsistent with the ideals of the faith they led. Alexander VI attended Mass daily and took the sacraments regularly. This was partly performance, certainly, but purely cynical performance would not have required the particular quality of regularity and private observation that the sources describe. There is something in the persistence of the devotional practice, even amid everything else, that suggests it was not entirely empty. Julius the Second, for all his military temper and political ruthlessness, had a quality of personal piety that his contemporaries noted. He fasted on the appropriate days. He made confessions. He was deeply moved by certain kinds of religious art and music in ways that were not merely political responses. The ambition that drove him toward the painting of the Sistine ceiling was partly, his biographers argue, a genuine desire to create a space worthy of the sacred, not just to glorify himself, but to glorify the God in whose name he ruled. The question of guilt is harder. Did these men lie awake at night and reckon with the contradictions of their lives? Did Alexander feel the weight of his children's deaths and his mistress's devotion alongside his prayers? Did Julius feel the deaths of the men killed in his military campaigns alongside his commissioning of magnificent art? We have very little direct evidence. The private interior life of a Renaissance pope is not a well-documented thing. But human nature being what it is, and faith being the tradition it is, one saturated with language about sin and guilt and the need for repentance, it seems unlikely that these were men entirely without conscience. More probable is that they lived with the particular kind of moral compartmentalization that allows human beings to hold contradictory things simultaneously. To sin and to believe, to transgress and to repent, to live in the gap between ideal and reality with a mixture of genuine regret and genuine justification.
There is one story from Alexander VI's papacy that I find particularly telling. When his beloved son Juan was found murdered in the Tiber River in 1497, killed by unknown hands, though suspicion fell on Cesare, Alexander withdrew from public life for several days in what all sources agree was genuine, devastated grief. He told the assembled cardinals that he loved Juan more than anything in the world, that he would give 7 tiaras to restore him to life. The grief was not performed. It was the grief of a father. And in that grief, the whole complexity of Alexander VI is somehow concentrated. A man whose love for his family was real,
whose pain at its loss was real, and whose faith, whatever its private form, was the framework through which he tried to make sense of a world where even popes could not protect the people they loved most. The deathbed moments of these popes are also suggestive. Julius the Second, dying in February of 1513, received the last sacraments with apparent sincerity. His dying was described by those present as the death of a man who believed. Leo X died suddenly of pneumonia in December of 1521, without the full ceremonies that a more prepared death would have allowed. Those who were present described a man startled by the end, not prepared, not serene, but human and frightened in the way that all human beings are frightened when the darkness arrives sooner than expected.
What these men believed in the deepest and most private parts of themselves, we cannot know with certainty. But that they believed something, that the faith they carried was not entirely hollow, even at its most compromised, seems more plausible than the alternative. They were shaped by it, they were educated in it, they dreamed in its language and measured their lives against its standards, even when they failed to meet them. And in the quiet hours before dawn, alone in their private oratories, with only the flicker of a candle and the weight of everything they had done and left undone, they spoke to whatever they understood God to be, in words that no one recorded and that history cannot retrieve. Section 13. The Slow Fade. Deaths, Legacies, and What They Left Behind. Every pontificate ends the same way. However long the reign, however magnificent the court, however complex the entanglements of family and politics and art and faith, the end is the same for a pope as it is for the humblest of his subjects. The man who spoke for God on earth returns to earth, and what remains is the record he left behind.
The deaths of the Renaissance popes were not, on the whole, peaceful or simple. Alexander VI died in August of 1503 after a sudden illness that struck simultaneously at him and his son Cesare. The timing and symptoms led immediately to whispers of poison, and those whispers have never entirely ceased, though modern historical analysis suggests malaria as the most likely culprit. The body was in such poor condition by the time it was prepared for lying in state that contemporaries' descriptions, which spoke of a blackened, swollen corpse, were alarming. It was said that getting the body into the coffin was a struggle because it had swollen so dramatically in the Roman heat. Whatever the cause, the death of Alexander VI was undignified in a way that his enemies found satisfyingly symbolic and his supporters found deeply painful. Cesare Borgia, who had built his entire political career on his father's papacy, was too ill to act effectively in the immediate aftermath. The new pope, Julius II, was openly hostile to the Borgia family, had, in fact, spent years in exile specifically to survive their dominance. Cesare was stripped of his position and eventually driven out of Italy, dying in a minor skirmish in Spain in 1507. The Borgia apartments in the Vatican were sealed and left untouched for centuries. The family that had dominated Rome so completely for a decade simply ceased to exist as a political force within a few years of Alexander's death.
Julius II died in February of 1513, at the age of 69 or 70, after a period of illness that did nothing to soften his temperament. He reportedly refused to follow his doctor's advice, continued to receive visitors and conduct business until almost the end, and died surrounded by his closest attendants with an intensity that matched the intensity with which he had lived. The Rome he left behind was physically transformed, St. Peter's Basilica rising, the Sistine ceiling completed, the papal apartments covered in Raphael's frescoes. The Swiss Guard he had founded stood at his death at their posts as they had done every day since 1506. They stand there still. Leo X died suddenly in December of 1521, the Protestant Reformation he had inadvertently helped to launch now fully underway, the revenues of the papacy stretched to breaking by his expenditures, the Vatican treasury empty. He had spent enormously and left debts. He had patronized art of permanent value and left an institution in financial crisis. He had enjoyed his pontificate with unreserved enthusiasm and left a church fractured in ways that would take centuries to even partially repair. In the weeks after his death, when the full extent of his debts became apparent, some of the cardinals who had attended his feasts reportedly considered whether there was enough silverware left to pay the servants. What did these men leave behind when everything else is set aside? The Sistine Chapel ceiling, the Raphael rooms, the foundation of what would become St. Peter's Basilica, the Vatican museums, the Swiss Guard. A church that was simultaneously more beautiful and more troubled than it had been before they came to power.
They also left behind a particular kind of story. The story of what happens when immense power is held by human beings rather than ideals. The story of how the gap between the sacred and the profane can be managed, negotiated, lived in, imperfectly, contradictorily, sometimes splendidly, and sometimes shamefully. The Renaissance popes were not saints, but they were not quite the cartoonish villains that later centuries sometimes made of them either. They were something more interesting and more complicated than either of those options. Men of their time, shaped by the culture that produced them, doing what men do with power and beauty and mortality. The Borgia apartments, sealed by Julius the Second as an act of deliberate erasure, were eventually reopened in the 19th century. The frescoes were still there, somewhat battered by time, but intact. The rooms where Alexander VI had lived and loved and ruled and grieved were still recognizable. His presence was still there in the walls, the way all presences eventually become part of the walls of the rooms where they lived.
That, perhaps, is the most persistent thing about the private lives of the Renaissance popes. The official record tries to manage them, to contain the contradictions, smooth the scandals, and present a version of the papacy that is consistent with its spiritual claims. But the private life is harder to manage than the official one. It seeps through. It persists in the diaries of secretaries, and the letters of ambassadors, and the memories of servants, and the paintings commissioned by men who wanted to be remembered. And 500 years later, in the quiet of a late night, it is still somehow present. The warmth of a candle in a private oratory, the sound of a lute in a great hall, the particular laugh of a man who kept an elephant in his garden and wept when it died. These details do not diminish the historical record. They complete it. They remind us that the record of events is always also the record of people, and that people are always, finally, individual. Not categories, not representatives, not symbols. People, specific and irreducible, living in particular rooms on particular days, with particular thoughts that no one else could have thought in exactly the same way.
Section 14. The Legacy in Stone and Silence. And so we arrive at the end of this long, slow walk through the corridors of the Renaissance papacy. Not the official end, not the formal summaries in history books or the solemn evaluations of papal councils, just the quiet end, the kind you reach when you have been walking for a long time through a very large and very old place, and you finally stop in a particular spot and let the stillness settle around you.
What remains of these men is extraordinary in its specificity and its permanence. Walk into the Sistine Chapel today and the ceiling is still there. Still the same ceiling that Michelangelo finished in 1512 under the impatient supervision of Julius the Second. The colours have been restored. The scaffolding that once filled the room is long gone. But the figures are unchanged, the same figures that Julius looked at and Michelangelo argued about, and Leo X walked beneath after his election in 1513. The creation of Adam, the Last Judgment added later by Michelangelo under a different commission, the gathered witnesses of the whole human story, painted with such force and precision and imagination that they remain 5 centuries later one of the most powerful things that human hands have ever made. Walk through the Raphael rooms in the Vatican museums and the frescoes are there. Raphael's luminous, perfectly composed images of the connection between ancient wisdom and Christian faith, painted for Julius II in the rooms where he read and received visitors and conducted the daily private business of the papacy. The School of Athens, the Disputation of the Holy Sacrament. These are not merely paintings, they are the visual record of a particular moment in human thought, when the ancient and the modern seemed capable of genuine synthesis, when the world felt large enough and the human mind felt ambitious enough to contain everything. The physical fabric of St. Peter's Basilica, rising above the Vatican, bears the fingerprints of Julius II and Leo X, and every pope who came after them and contributed to what became the most famous church in the world. The decision to demolish the old basilica and begin again, made by Julius in 1506, was one of the most consequential architectural decisions in history. The result, completed nearly a century and a half after Julius died, is a building that still holds the breath of everyone who walks into it for the first time. And then there are the smaller things, the records in Vatican archives of a pet elephant named Hanno and the grief of a pope when he died, the letters in which Michelangelo complained about the working conditions and the demanding pope and the pain in his neck, the diary entries of Johann Burckhardt describing the daily ceremonies of the Vatican with the precise, slightly alarmed tone of a man who saw more than he was entirely comfortable with. The account books showing what Leo X spent on his feasts and how quickly the treasury emptied. The letters Lucrezia Borgia wrote and received, preserved in the archives of Ferrara, giving us a glimpse of the inner life of a woman at the center of the most dramatic family in Renaissance Italy.
These are the private lives, not the painted portraits, but the living record, not the official version, but the human one. And in the human one, something endures that the official version cannot quite capture. The quality of being alive in a particular moment, a particular body, a particular web of love and ambition and faith and failure in the most magnificent and most contradictory institution that the Western world had produced. The Renaissance popes were not great Christians in the moral sense that the title might be expected to imply, but they were great humans in the full and complicated sense of that word, men who lived at the intersection of the sacred and the profane with an intensity that still resonates. Men who built things and broke things and loved people and made art and made mistakes and prayed in the dark and died as all of us die, leaving behind a world changed by their having been in it. And in the end, this is what history gives us, if we are willing to look at it carefully and without too much impatience for simple conclusions. Not saints, not monsters, people, with all the texture and contradiction and occasional surprising tenderness that people carry with them everywhere they go. Even when everywhere they go is the apostolic palace, and the candles burning around them are the finest beeswax, and the ceiling above them has been painted by Michelangelo, and the man kneeling at the next pew is the most powerful figure in Christendom. Even then,
Consider what it means, finally, that the art survived. The paintings on the walls of the Sistine Chapel were made by a man who quarreled with the Pope who commissioned them, who suffered physically during their creation, who was underpaid and overworked, and stretched far beyond what he had initially agreed to. The relationship between Michelangelo and Julius II was contentious, frustrating, and at times genuinely adversarial. And yet what came out of that friction, that particular combination of a difficult artist and a difficult pope, is something that has outlasted every political consideration that surrounded its creation by 500 years, and shows every sign of continuing to outlast human calculation indefinitely. This is one of history's more remarkable facts. The private tensions and difficulties of two imperfect men in a complicated relationship produced something that subsequent generations have consistently recognized as among the most significant achievements of human creative life. It came out of the mess of human reality, not despite it. That is worth sitting with for a moment.
What does it mean that we still visit these places? That millions of people each year stand in the Sistine Chapel and look up at a ceiling painted by a man working in physical discomfort, under pressure from a pope with a temper, in a political context that was corrupt and complicated and very far from the ideals it professed. It means, perhaps, that beauty is not diminished by the humanity of its origins, that the ceiling does not become less beautiful when we know that Michelangelo was tired and underpaid, that the Raphael rooms are not less luminous when we know that Julius was difficult and Rome was politically turbulent, that the private lives of the people who created or commissioned these things are part of the work, embedded in it, and that knowing something about those lives makes the encounter with the work richer rather than poorer. This is what history at its most patient and most careful can give us. Not the excuse to dismiss greatness because its originators were flawed, and not the excuse to excuse the flaws because the greatness was real, but the more difficult and more rewarding territory in between, the understanding that greatness and flaw coexist, that they always have, and that the record of their coexistence is the actual human story we are all part of. Section 15. The voices that weren't recorded. Servants, secretaries, and shadows. History is written by those with access to writing materials and the leisure to use them. In the Vatican of the Renaissance, this meant cardinals, papal secretaries, and visiting diplomats, men of education and standing, who noticed the things that men of education and standing tend to notice. What they recorded is invaluable. What they left out is sometimes just as revealing. The domestic life of the papal court was maintained by a vast, largely invisible workforce. The kitchen staff, the launderers, the stable hands, the gardeners, the torch-bearers, the night watchmen who walked the corridors while the Vatican slept, the women who made the beds and changed the linens and swept the floors before dawn so that everything would be in order when the morning ceremonies began. These people saw things, they heard things, they were present in rooms when great conversations happened and great decisions were made. They polished the armor and carried the slop buckets and arranged the flowers on the banquet tables, and were, in the memory of history, almost entirely absent. We know some of them by name because they appear in account books or in the records of unusual incidents. Johann Burchard, the master of papal ceremonies who kept his famous diary, was himself a kind of senior servant, a meticulous, somewhat horrified chronicler who recorded the daily proceedings of the Vatican with the discipline of a man who understood that he was witnessing history, and the emotional register of someone who sometimes wished he wasn't. His diary is one of the most extraordinary documents of the Renaissance, detailed, frank, and occasionally so specific about what he observed that readers across the centuries have found themselves grateful for his conscientiousness and slightly sorry for his having had to be present.
The secretaries who managed the Pope's private correspondence occupy a particular shadow in the historical record. These were educated men, often in minor orders, who handled the flow of private letters, the ones that did not go through official channels, the ones that contained what the Pope actually thought, rather than what he was officially saying. Some of these letters survive in archives, many were destroyed. The secretaries themselves wrote memoirs and letters in which they recorded their impressions, their observations, their private assessments of the man they served. Reading these sources, you sometimes catch the clearest glimpse of the private pope, seen through eyes that were close enough to observe the man, but low enough in the hierarchy to have no particular stake in maintaining his official image. What did the servants of Leo X think of him? They seem on balance to have liked him. He was reportedly generous to household staff, known for acts of personal kindness that the official record barely mentions. He remembered faces and names. He noticed when someone was ill and made provision for their care. These are small things, but they are telling small things. They suggest a man whose warmth was not reserved for great occasions, but present in the ordinary texture of daily life. The servants of Julius II seem to have been rather more in awe than affection. He was not, by all accounts, an easy employer. His temper was real and could be frightening, but he was also, it seems, fundamentally fair. He did not hold grudges against those who served him faithfully. He rewarded loyalty, and he had a kind of rough directness that those around him came to value, even when it was uncomfortable.
The servants of Alexander VI were closest, in some ways, to the most intimate version of his private life, because the household of the Borgia Pope was more genuinely domestic than that of most of his contemporaries. Children coming and going, the particular atmosphere of a family home superimposed on the grandeur of the Vatican, the voices of Cesare and Lucrezia and their siblings echoing through corridors that were also corridors of state. For the servants, this was simply the household where they worked. They knew the children as people rather than as symbols. They knew the relationship between Alexander and Vanozza de Catani as the relationship between two particular people, rather than as a theological problem. They saw the whole thing from the ground floor, which is sometimes the most honest view.
These lives remain largely unrecorded, which is one of history's persistent losses. The people who sustained the private life of the Renaissance papacy, who made the beds and cooked the food and carried the messages and kept everything running, are gone from the record in ways that the popes they served are not. But they were there, and without them, nothing that we remember about this era would have been possible. Think for a moment about what it would have been like to be a kitchen boy in the Vatican during Leo X's pontificate. You would have arrived before dawn and left after midnight on feast days. Your hands would have been permanently stained with the juices of whatever the day's preparation required. You would have worked within 50 feet of the most powerful man in Christendom, and would never, in the ordinary course of events, have exchanged a word with him. You would have seen the incredible dishes carried out of the kitchen on their way to tables you would never sit at. You would have eaten the scraps and the leftovers, which were still, even as scraps, better than what most people in Rome were having for dinner. You would have heard the music from the banqueting hall filtering through the stone corridors as you washed the pots. And perhaps, on the best nights, you might have heard something else too. Laughter, genuine and unpracticed, the sound of a man enjoying himself, carried through the walls of the most magnificent residence in Italy, and arriving quietly in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and roasting fat, and the specific exhaustion of very long days. That is the private life too, not just the Pope's, but everyone's. Section 16. The world they made, and the world that unmade them.
They made Rome. This is not a metaphor. The physical city of Rome that exists today, the Rome that millions of people visit every year and stand before in a state of sustained amazement, was largely created by the ambitions and the expenditures of the Renaissance papacy. The Vatican museums, St. Peter's Square and Basilica, the Sistine Chapel, the Raphael Rooms, the Vatican Library, the transformation of Rome from a city of medieval ruins into a city of Renaissance splendor, all of this traces back in direct and traceable ways to the popes we have been talking about tonight. Julius the Second did not build St. Peter's with his own hands, but he made the decision and provided the resources and maintained the will across his entire pontificate, and without that there is no St. Peter's. They made also the Catholic Counter-Reformation, though indirectly and involuntarily. The abuses that the Renaissance popes normalized and extended were precisely the targets that the reformers aimed at. Without the spectacle of a papacy that sold offices, kept mistresses, fathered children, and spent lavishly on personal pleasure while claiming to speak for God, the reform movements might have found less traction with their audiences. The Renaissance popes, in their very excessiveness, made the case for reform by demonstrating so comprehensively what an unreformed church looked like. They also made the conditions for their own undoing. The corruption and extravagance and institutional self-dealing that characterized the Renaissance papacy at its most excessive was precisely what provoked the religious reform movements that eventually split Western Christianity. Martin Luther was not responding to abstract theological disagreement when he nailed, or more likely sent by mail, but nailed is the better story, his arguments against indulgences to the church door at Wittenberg in 1517. He was responding to something specific and visible and deeply offensive. The spectacle of a pope in Rome spending the money of German Christians on parties and buildings while telling them that buying a piece of paper would save their souls.
The Reformation, as it unfolded in the years and decades after Luther's protest, transformed the world in ways that no one in 1517 could have entirely predicted. Western Christianity divided. Countries took sides. Wars were fought, terrible, devastating wars that killed hundreds of thousands of people and remade the map of Europe. The Council of Trent, called by Paul III, the Pope whose sister had been Alexander VI's mistress, the petticoat cardinal's sister, which is one of history's more remarkable circles, eventually produced a Catholic counter-reformation that addressed many of the genuine abuses the reformers had complained about. Future popes would be held to standards of personal conduct that would have seemed almost impossibly restrictive to their Renaissance predecessors.
The age of the Renaissance Pope ended not with a single event, but with a gradual tightening of expectations, a reform of the institution from within, a slow shift from the spectacular excess of Leo X to something more austere, more careful, more aware of the cost of contradiction. The world that made men like Alexander VI and Leo X possible, the world of Italian political maneuvering, of artistic magnificence as a form of power, of celibacy as a theoretical ideal rather than a practical requirement, that world was transformed. It did not disappear overnight, but it changed deeply, changed permanently. And the men we have been thinking about tonight, the men who lived in those gilded rooms and ate those extraordinary meals and commissioned those incomparable works of art, and loved their families and fought their battles, and prayed in the dark, and died as all of us die, they became history. They became the Renaissance papacy, that extraordinary and troubling and magnificent episode in the long human story. They became what we talk about on quiet nights when we want to understand something about power and faith and beauty and the unavoidable, irreducible complexity of the inhuman in a world that asks both too little and too much of us simultaneously. Epilogue: What remains in the dark. The Vatican is quiet at this hour, or rather it is quiet in the way that very old and very occupied places are quiet, not truly silent, but settled, as if the weight of all that has happened within its walls has given it a particular gravity that holds even the noise to a lower register. Somewhere in the Apostolic Palace, in rooms that are now part of the Vatican museums or part of the working offices of the Holy See, the shapes of the rooms that these popes lived in are still there. The walls that Raphael painted are still there. The private oratories where they knelt in the dark are still there. The gardens where Leo's elephant walked and Julius's rose gardens we maintained with such care are still there, still green, still quiet in the early morning when Rome has not yet woken up, and the sky above the Vatican is the particular shade of blue that precedes the sun. In the Vatican archives, sealed away in their carefully controlled environment, are the documents of the Renaissance papacy. Thousands and thousands of pages, letters and account books and decrees and private correspondence, written in the careful hands of secretaries long dead, authorized by the seals of popes who died 5 centuries ago. Scholars go there to read them, working in white gloves in climate-controlled reading rooms, handling parchment that was last touched by people living in a world before printing presses were common, before the Reformation, before the Americas were known to Europeans. When you hold one of those documents, you are holding a piece of the private world we have been visiting tonight. You are holding something that was in the room,
something that passed through the hands of the people we have been talking about.
What are we left with at the end of this long journey? Perhaps something like this: that the most powerful people in the most powerful institution of the Western world were, in their private lives, recognizably human. That they wanted the same things that most people want: love, connection, pleasure, meaning, a sense that what they were doing mattered. That they lived with the same kinds of internal contradictions that most people live with, only in grander rooms and with greater consequences. That the art they made is real and lasting and genuinely beautiful, and that this does not require us to be uncritical of how it was made or who made it. That the faith they professed, however imperfectly they lived it, shaped their inner lives in ways that were not entirely superficial. That the families they loved were loved genuinely, even when that love expressed itself in ways that made the institutional church uncomfortable. That history, when we look at it closely enough and with enough patience, is always a story about people, not abstractions, not symbols, people, with bodies that ached and minds that worried and hearts that attached themselves to things and other people with a stubbornness that no amount of power or ceremony or official dignity could entirely override.
Think about Julius the Second, lying awake in his painted apartment in the middle of the night, somewhere around the year 1510. He is in his late 60s. He has been Pope for 7 years. The Sistine Chapel ceiling is not finished. The new St. Peter's is years away from completion. The French are causing trouble in northern Italy again. His gout is acting up. He has, in the past several months, led a military siege in freezing weather, argued with Michelangelo, received ambassadors, written letters, managed the finances of a large and often unruly institution, presided over mass, made decisions that affected the lives of millions of people, and done all of this without ever once being able to fully relax, because being fully relaxed is not something the papacy permits. In the dark, in the silence, he turns over onto his side, and the old joints complain, and outside the Swiss guard walks his slow route, and somewhere in the city a dog barks, and Julius della Rovere, Pope of Rome, closes his eyes and tries to sleep. That is the private life, that ordinary, intimate, inescapably human moment at the end of an extraordinary day. Think about Leo X on one of those evenings when the music has finally stopped and the guests have gone home and the servants have quietly cleared the last of the dishes. He is sitting alone by a fire, probably later in his pontificate, the treasury worryingly depleted, the reports about Martin Luther growing more alarming with each month. The elephant Hanno is gone, dead in 1516, and still missed, genuinely missed, in the way you miss something that was simply a source of uncomplicated pleasure in a life that doesn't have enough of those. He is possibly reading, possibly staring at the fire, possibly dictating a private letter to someone who will record it carefully and seal it and send it in the morning. Whatever he is doing it as himself, not as the Pope, not as the Medici heir, not as the patron of Raphael and Michelangelo, not as the man who allegedly said, "Let us enjoy it," but as the person underneath all those identities, the person who was born in a Florence he will never fully get back to, who grew up surrounded by beauty and learning, who sat at this improbable height and tried to make sense of what it meant. The candle in the private oratory is almost out now. The rooms have grown still. The great palace settles around the silence the way it has settled around every silence for 500 years, holding the memory of everyone who has moved through it, the powerful and the obscure, the celebrated and the forgotten, the man who painted God touching Adam's finger, and a servant who swept the floor beneath the scaffolding, the Pope who said, "Let us enjoy it," and the Pope who climbed the scaffolding in a fury because the thing he wanted was taking too long. They are all there in the walls, all of them, all of us eventually. And that, perhaps, is enough for one evening. Let the images settle. Let the candles go out one by one in the great halls of your imagination. Let the sound of the lutes and the fountains and the distant prayers fade into the quieter sound of your own breathing. The Rome outside your window may be a different Rome, or may be very far away. But somewhere tonight, the same stars that hung above the Vatican in 1510 are still out there, and the same silence that settled over the corridors after the servants went to bed is still a kind of silence, and the human need for sleep that closed the eyes of popes and kitchen boys alike is still the same need, and you carry it in you right now, the same as they did.
History, at its most patient and most generous, offers exactly this. Not answers to every question, not a clean accounting of who was right and who was wrong, but a kind of company, the quiet company of people who have already walked the roads you are walking, who have already asked the questions that keep you awake at night, who have already felt the weight of their own contradictions and lived with them as best they could, and left behind, when they were done, whatever they had managed to make. The Renaissance popes made a great deal. Not all of it was good, but much of it was beautiful. And the beautiful things are still there, in the rooms, in the walls, in the light falling through the old windows onto stone floors that have known 500 years of footsteps. You have been walking through 500 years of human history, and it has been beautiful and flawed and real. Rest now. The corridors are quiet. The candles have gone out one by one. The great palace is still. Sleep comes for all of us, even the most powerful, and tonight it comes for you too. If these slow journeys through history help you find sleep, it would mean the world to me if you liked this video and subscribed to the channel. We are working toward 1,000 subscribers here at Heyo, Boring History for Sleep, and every single one of you helps us get there. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from tonight and what the clock says on your wall. Bring your sleepy hype if you have any left. We collect it here with gratitude. Sleep well, wherever you are.